Can you all hear me okay? Is this a good volume? All right. Well, welcome to another Senior Wednesday. Thank you everyone for coming out today. Before we get started, I've got a couple of announcements. The museum is looking for volunteers with sewing experience to help our collection staff with a project that they could use some extra hands on. So if you are a sewer, let me know later after the program or shoot us an email at volunteer@worldtreasures.org. I also have cards that I can give you because yeah, we could use volunteers for collections on just sewing together some fabric to make uniform covers. So let me know about that. And also mark your calendars for April 26th. That is our annual Mott Gala coming up. Tickets aren't on sale yet, so just save the date, April 26th. But tickets will be going on sale at the end of March, on March 28th. So that'll be a lot of fun. Next month, our Senior Wednesday speaker is going to be Dr. Leonard Krishtalka, Director Emeritus at KU's Biodiversity Institute and Professor Emeritus in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. He will be giving a talk on April 3rd called Forget Everything You Thought You Knew About Life. Before that, we have Coffee with the Curator coming up on March 20th with Deborah Hahn, Associate Professor of Geography from Emporia State University. She will be giving a talk called The Columbian Exchange and the First Ripples of Globalization. So mark your calendars for March 20th and April 3rd, and then April 26th is the Mott Gala. Today we are delighted to host Dr. Suzanne Orr, Associate Professor of History at Kansas State University. She received her PhD from the University of Notre Dame, where she studied Notre Dame. That was my French education messing me up there. University of Notre Dame, where she studied 20th century American history, immigration, and gender. She is published in the Journal of the West and the Journal of American Ethnic History, forthcoming in spring 2025. And previously, she served as managing editor of Kansas History, a journal of the Central Plains. Her first book, The Politics of Asylum, Reds, Refugees, and Humanitarianism, is under contract with the University of North Carolina Press. Please, without further ado, give a warm welcome to Professor Suzanne Orr.
Well, thank you very much for having me here today. I'm excited to talk to you. And so my talk today will be about the first Red Scare, which is the Red Scare that happens after World War I. And it's not usually what people think of when they think of Red Scare. Normally people think 1950s, McCarthyism. But there was this earlier Red Scare that has a significant impact on 20th century US history. And it is also the United States government's first attempt at trying mass deportations. And they will attempt to deport en masse immigrants who are accused of radicalism, being anarchists and being communists. They will especially focus on immigrants from Eastern Europe, especially Russia. And so that's what I'm going to focus on in my talk today. So I'd like to start out by telling a story first. So this is the Bukovetsky family. The father, Alexander, his wife, Frances, and they have two children, Violet, who is 13 years old, and they have a son, William, who is 9. And this image is from Alexander Bukovetsky's deportation file. So he was a member of the Union of Russian Workers. It's a small anarchist organization. Most people don't even remember it now. It's not a name that's very familiar anymore. But it was one of the organizations that was a target of government raids after World War I. And he is arrested in a raid in Detroit in 1919. It's done in November on the 2-year anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. So that date was symbolic. That's why the government chose that date for these raids. So he's arrested, and he waits over a year for his deportation. And he's being held in custody in Detroit. And in the meantime, his family is waiting, not knowing what's going to happen. And initially, Frances had thought this deportation would happen immediately. And so she'd sold the family's belongings. She was preparing to go back to Russia. And this was something Alexander actually really wanted. He wanted to go back after the revolution. He wanted to rebuild a new utopian society. But the wait grows longer and longer. And while he's in custody, his wife and daughter, Violet, go and visit him. And there's an incident. And guards end up hitting Frances as well as Alexander. And at this point, the family is just really desperate to leave. So they don't have a lot of support. They've lost his wages. And so there's the issue of they're desperate to leave, but can they afford to leave? So if the government is going to deport Alexander, well, what about the rest of the family? What about Frances and the 2 children? And especially their youngest child, William, he wasn't actually born in Russia. He was born in Canada. So how do you send this family back together? Is it even possible? So Frances will tell immigration inspectors that she and her daughter entered the country illegally, that they didn't pay a head tax, which is a deportable offense. So the government will declare them basically too poor to stay. They violated this act, and the government will pay for Frances's and Violet's tickets to Russia. That leaves them with only 1 ticket to pay. So this, this family is caught in the system. And when other people are looking at what happens to them, there are lots of Americans who were anti-radical, who strongly supported these raids. They wanted the mass deportations, but there were definitely opponents as well, including a lot of people who considered themselves progressive reformers, people who worked with immigrants, and they opposed the raids. But now that the raids have happened, they want to try and keep families together. And so they consider this a victory, that the government is willing to deport this family together as a group. So what happens though? They do actually get sent to Soviet Russia, and a few months later, they flee Soviet Russia. Violet tells her story about what happened, and she actually writes to the United States government later on, and she tells them Russia is, and these are her words, it's a terror-stricken country where living is nothing less than misery. What happened? They got there. They hold on to their possessions initially. They end up giving their possessions away, the things that they had prepared. And they're trying to make their way back to Alexander's home. He is a Russian speaker, he was, but from Ukraine. So he's on his way home, and the government in Russia, the secret police, arrest him there because they say he's a class enemy. He is the wrong kind of radical. So Frances, with some help, is able to get him out of prison in Russia. And they end up fleeing first to Germany and then to Canada. And so it's in Canada where Violet starts petitioning the American government to allow her and her family back into the United States after the deportations. And this story, it touches on a bunch of themes within American history and immigration in this period. Questions of, is it acceptable for immigration officials to break families apart as part of the deportation process? What should happen to immigrants if the government decides they need to be deported for security reasons, but they might not be safe in the countries to which they're deported? Does the United States have a responsibility as a nation of asylum to migrants fleeing war and revolution? If so, to which ones? And so the immigration inspectors, when they hear Violet's petitions in the 1920s, they can see her in multiple ways. They can see her as an undesirable immigrant, someone who comes from a family of radicals, people who've been deported, people potentially dangerous, such that she's tainted by this radicalism. But on the other side, they can also, if they want to, choose to see her as a refugee from communism. And so the question is, which is she? So my research on political radicals and political refugees, explores this idea of how does the United States determine who's a menace to society and who is a refugee in need of aid. And immigrants might define themselves, might find that they're defined as both, depending on who is talking. They could be seen as the purveyors of violence and terrorism. They could be seen as victims of foreign revolutions, as martyrs to the failings of American democracy, for instance, from the people who opposed the idea of raids in the first place. So Americans often used immigrant stories to promote a vision of the nation as a place of refuge for the world's outcasts, as a barricade against the spread of anarchism and communism. But immigrants accepted and rejected these definitions for their own varied purposes. They might need to be able to cross boundaries. They might need to receive aid. And so they're well aware of these stereotypes in American society, and they play on these images as well. So I'm gonna flip sides here. So just a little bit of background about the Red Scare itself. So the first Red Scare, it happens after World War I, and it grows out of the experience of the war. So after the war ended, soldiers are demobilizing, people are coming home, there aren't enough jobs, unemployment is high, there are problems with inflation, and there are going to be waves of strikes and riots in this post-World War I period as American society is starting to readjust. And within this, there's a series of bombings in the summer of 1919. And the Attorney General at the time, Alexander Mitchell Palmer, he is going to decide to conduct mass raids in the United States. And Palmer, part of the reason he's doing this, he is strongly anti-radical. He believes in these ideas. But at the same time, he also wants to be president. And so this is one way for him to make himself a household name. So I just have some images up here of depictions of immigrants and radicalism in that post-World War I period. And you can see, the immigrant whose head is drawn as a bomb. This fear that the United States has that with unrestricted immigration, that this is a danger to US security. And this here is an image of Palmer. And as part of the series of bombings and terrorist events that happen, one of the bombs actually blows up the front of his own house. So this is his home, where radicals have destroyed with the bomb the front of his house. So when Palmer decides to run these raids, they're done in two stages. There's the first set of raids that happen in 1919, in November. And those are really the practice raids. Those are directed at the Union of Russian Workers. And about 1,200 or so people are arrested in coordinated raids. This was practiced, though, for much bigger raids that were going to happen in January of 2020. And those raids were directed against the newly formed communist parties in the United States. So at this moment, there's a proliferation of radical organizations. There's this renewed spirit in the United States after the war and after the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia that brought Lenin to power. There's sudden interest among radicals. And so there's this huge growth in organizations like the Socialist Party, the Communist Party, and also the Communist Labor Party. There was more than one Communist Party in this period. And this is also something that the government is really worried about as they're watching the membership of these organizations grow, as they see terrorist events happening like the bombings. So, so they have a genuine fear that there could be a revolution like the Bolshevik Revolution in the United States. And so that's part of what's really driving them to have the raids. So I have also here, these are some images of membership books from the Union of Russian Workers. So the government goes out, the raids are conducted by the Bureau of Investigation, that's the forerunner of the FBI, and they're done in tandem with local police officers. They're conducted in cities throughout the country, especially though in the Northeast and the Midwest. And when they run the raids, they arrest everyone who's in meeting halls, for instance. People are there gathering for celebrations for the anniversary of the revolution. They arrest people in the halls, they arrest people in their homes, and they confiscate everything they've got on them that looks radical. And often these government agents, they did not read foreign languages. The US government had a lot of trouble recruiting enough foreign language speakers. So they grab everything that looks foreign to them. And so they get everything from communist literature, things like this, membership books in a radical organization, which they can use as evidence to just kind of ordinary things. A copy of Tolstoy's War and Peace, because if it was in Russian, they took it all. So this is the type of stuff that they're gathering. And there is a lot of media at the time really focused on the dangers of radicalism to the United States and Russian radicals in particular. Often Russian-speaking radicals, they viewed themselves as the true heirs of the revolution. And these are some, up here, this is a pretty typical depiction of what Russian radicals were drawn as in the popular press. This kind of wild eyes, hair everywhere. This man is depicted as carrying a bomb and a knife, really typical style depiction, that they're here to destroy American democracy. The image next to it is a little more, it's attached to a story that's a little more whimsical, basically. That this image comes from the Chicago Tribune, and the Lincoln Park Zoo had acquired 2 new tigers from Siberia. And so they do this series of stories about the tigers as Russian immigrants being caged in the zoo. And they called them immigrants from Bolshevikia, but unlike actual Russian radicals who are people, according to the Chicago Tribune, these immigrants know who the boss is. And so they are safely contained at the Lincoln Park Zoo. But it's still playing on these fears as radicals, as subhuman in a way. They are dehumanizing images. So these raids end up, the numbers vary a lot in terms of the arrests. They think about 1,200 in the first set of raids and anywhere between 5,000 and 10,000 in the second set of raids. It's really hard to get accurate numbers. But these are some images also of what happened during the raids and what happens afterwards. So this here is an image of a people's house in New York that the government had gone through looking for evidence and arresting people. These people here, this is also an image from Chicago, were labeled as types caught in the raids. And so it was supposed to be showing them in particular as dangerous, potentially immoral. Here's a woman being arrested with a man in this radical hall, at night, not her husband. It's supposed to be showing them as menacing. And also, I've some examples of the kind of stuff that was confiscated in the raids. What the government does with all of this is, so they collect it during the raids itself and save it as evidence for people's deportation hearings. So they're really targeting immigrants because immigrants can be deported. American citizens who might belong to, say, the Communist Party could not be deported, but immigrants could be. And so all of this is saved for their immigration hearings. And the National Archives in Washington, D.C. still has it all, stuffed into folders. They have an enormous collection of radical documents, newspapers, photographs, things that don't survive anyplace else. So some images. And also, like, they collected the objects that people were carrying on them as well. So they have folders now filled with things like stamps and red ribbons. This was a banner that was confiscated at one of the meetings. And apparently the people who were arrested in that radical meeting hall had never seen this before. They had no idea where it came from. That was a consistent response across all of the interviews. Another example of one of the newspapers that was used as evidence. This one is called Bread and Freedom. So the United States government's goal is to deport all of these people en masse to Soviet Russia. There are some problems with this plan. First, the United States doesn't have a real working relationship with the government in Soviet Russia. So usually deportation, it requires two parts. A government who wants to send people, but also a government who's willing to receive people. And so you need the cooperation of the other government, which the United States did not have. So this was the first, big attempt to send a group of people over. This ship here is called the USS Buford, and the United States government packed 249 deportees onto this boat and sent them to Hango, Finland, where they were then marched across the border on foot, to get into the Soviet Union. And so this here is a picture emphasizing, for anti-radicals, the popularity of this plan, that they are sending these 249 people back, and the United States is far better off without them. And there's this ongoing theme, the sense that, that for Russian radicals living in the United States, that it's easy for them to be critical of the US government and to say, we want to go back to the Soviet Union, or we want to go back to Russia, but then to not like what they find there. And so you see this kind of image used over and over again in anti-radical propaganda, the sense of they're going to be sorry. And they're going to realize how great the United States was and how much they miss us after we're gone. So the US government, very supportive of the raids itself and the concept of mass deportation, but they're running into practical problems. Things like, where do you put this many people who've been arrested? They need immigration hearings. How do you have enough officials to go through all of these people, to hear all of these cases, to make decisions? And then the practical aspects of how do you get them to the countries they're supposed to go to? Not everyone was from Russia. They were from lots of other countries. Sometimes people didn't know what territory they were from anymore because World War I redrew the map of Europe. So it's like, well, someone might have come from the Russian Empire, but are they supposed to go back to Russia, or is the territory they came from, is it in another country right now? And how well is it organized? It was unclear. And then there are going to be people who are arrested who are from Italy, from Mexico, from the Ottoman Empire. So it becomes a pretty complex system that the United States turns out they're trying to run. It wasn't so easy to just conduct the mass arrests and have people leave quickly. And so that's part of how Alexander and his family are waiting for over a year while this deportation process is churning through. So there are going to be a bunch of American critics who oppose the mass raids in the first place, and then who oppose how the United States government is handling what happens after the raids. And these are some, images over here of the kind of defense that immigrant supporters mount on their behalf. So women in particular who were interested in immigration reform, interested in ideas about protecting women, children, and families in the United States, they're going to be the ones who take up this cause. And they really start to try and counter the government's propaganda of these people are dangerous radicals by instead putting out propaganda about how a lot of these people are actually family men. They have dependents in the United States, and women and children will be left alone. They're starving without breadwinners. So you have on one side the US government and anti-radical propaganda pushing the evils of Bolshevism, the evils of Russian radicals, and then these counter image from Americans who want to stop the mass deportations, emphasizing the harmful effects that this had on families. And so that's part of this story here. Youngsters will have to give up home or go to Bolshevist Russia. So this idea of they're trying to turn these people who've been portrayed as dangerous in the press into people who are far more sympathetic. And that's running counter to years and years of these negative stereotypes. There had been assumptions that, well, people who are anarchists, people who are communists, these aren't family men, these are single men. The government would refer to them as floaters. They'd go around from place to place. They were rootless. That's part of what made them so dangerous. And so now you have reformers pushing back on that, saying, no, there are a lot of people with families in the United States. And so this picture in the middle, this is an image of Helen Todd. She is one of these female reformers, someone with, who considered themselves a progressive in early 20th century America. And so she's one of the people advocating on behalf of immigrants' families to the United States government. And this here is Francis Garvin. He's a government official who's trying to manage this bad publicity, basically, for the US government. And so she's going and talking to him, arguing with him, saying, well, what are you going to do about families? And his response, which is the response of the US government at first, is basically, why are you talking to me about families? Most of them don't have families, and if they do, it doesn't matter. He calls the Russian immigrants who are arrested, he's like, they're in the same class as criminals. They're in the same class as murderers. We don't worry about the families of criminals, what happens to them when they're arrested. And so, he doesn't think that this is something that the government really needs to worry about at all. And then, there's the next level of it of he's like, okay, if they do have families, and you've got examples of people with families, why on earth would they want to go to Soviet Russia? He's like, this is a place where there is, where there's suffering, where there's starvation. Wouldn't these families be better off in the United States? So there's this fight going on back and forth. What do you do with these people's families? And Garvin, he tries to argue that it's okay to not do anything. And in fact, he basically says suffering is good for them. They're a godless people. So playing on that image of atheists and communists, they're a godless people, and suffering will make them believe in God. So this is a good thing. And here are some more examples of Americans who are going to join this protest against the mass deportations. So some figures who are well known, whose names might still be familiar now, others who've been more forgotten. But Jane Addams, who was a founder of a settlement house called Hull House, basically a community center that would help immigrants in Chicago. She was one of the people who was also pushing on this, pushing on the government. What are you going to do about families? Saying the raids were wrong. Felix Frankfurter, future Supreme Court Justice, he's going to be one of the lawyers along with other people within the legal community who say that these raids were basically unjust, unconstitutional. This was an overreach of American power. And Agnes Inglis, she's someone who's from Detroit, who's working in Detroit, and she's one of the people actually working with the Bukovetsky family to try and keep them together. So there are a bunch of critics who are opposing the US government's raids. And ultimately, what's going to happen is the United States government is going to have to back off some from that position of we're not very concerned about the families. They realize that there's basically enough bad publicity that's saying there are women and children who are going to be left behind in the United States without the support of a breadwinner. A lot of these children may be US citizens. The government has a responsibility to try and do something. And so they do things in limited ways to try and find support for families. Or in the case of Violet's family, it worked out that immigration inspectors were able to kind of cobble together a way to deport the family together in a way that could kind of make sense and be affordable for them. So that's what this protest is doing. And the government will not succeed in deporting as many people as it had thought, because the US government had initially promised that the USS Buford, that's the first boat. There's going to be boat after boat of radicals leaving the United States. And that ultimately, it doesn't happen. Some people absolutely do get deported, but they're not in it's not in the volume that people initially thought. So for the Bukovetsky family, they are one of the groups that end up deported to Russia. So then there's this story, of suffering that comes afterwards and the plea to get back into the United States. It very much is in line with what US officials were, in a sense, expecting, what they thought about Russia. At this moment in the early 1920s, you start to see a growing number of stories appearing in the American press about what's really happening in Russia, how bad things really are. You get some positive stories, but there's a lot of negative ones as well. And this is one of the well-known ones here. This in the middle is Emma Goldman. She's a well-known, at the time, American radical. She was an anarchist. She believed in radical things like free love as well. She wanted like an entire restructuring of society. And she was one of the people who was deported on the USS Buford. And so this is, showing the image of her here, being cataloged by the United States, awaiting deportation. She's one of the people sent back. And initially, she's really hopeful, like many radicals were, that this was going to be a new utopian society. And she is incredibly disillusioned by what she finds. And she ends up writing a book about it, my disillusionment in Russia. And she initially sent it to her publishers as a complete book, and somehow they lost the last 12 chapters of the book. And so they had to publish the second half. And so we ended up with my further disillusionment in Russia once the publishers got the back half of the book all together. In this full-length book, as critical as she is of of the new Bolshevik government. She never gives up on her own positions of being an anarchist. Like, she doesn't suddenly embrace a particular vision of American democracy because she didn't like what was happening in the Soviet Union. But she flees, as well. That being said, American audiences are inclined to ignore the part that's still emphasizing she's an anarchist, and instead focus on the disillusionment and focus on what she says is wrong about Russia. So when US immigration officials later on see a story like Violet Bukovetsky's talking about how Russia is misery, how it's a country filled with suffering, that's very much a narrative that they're expecting. It's a story that confirms US superiority. It tells people exactly, what they think about, about the Soviet Union as being evil. So they're very much, primed for this kind of story, and are also inclined to see her in a more sympathetic way because of it. So, although she doesn't, really want to highlight this to immigration officials when she's trying to get back into the United States, the story of what happened to Violet Bukovetsky in Russia and how her mother succeeded in getting her father away from the Russian secret police, it actually involved Emma Goldman. So the family, after Alexander was arrested, they're stranded at a Moscow train station. And the mother actually goes to Emma Goldman, who had already been deported. And it's Emma Goldman who's the one who gets him free. She still has enough pull, enough notoriety to get him released. And it's on the condition that the family leaves the Soviet, the Soviet Russia, like they leave right away. And so they absolutely do that. So saying anything about Emma Goldman would have raised red flags to American immigration officials at the time. But when they read Violet's story about wanting to come back to the United States, they see her, and they actually call her a girl with promise. And they use the word promise. And they start to think maybe it was unfair that she is being punished for her father's radicalism. And Violet is trying to get the whole country back into the United States. But she actually ends up talking to the same immigration inspector who was in charge of her father's deportation in Detroit. And he ends up being sympathetic. And he decides that both Violet and her mother should be allowed to receive passes to enter the United States. So they had fled to Canada. They're on the Canadian side of the border, but within commuting distance of Detroit. And so she and her mother now have passes where they can freely move back and forth between Canada and the United States. So for instance, to find a better job. And this was a normal labor pattern at the time. And this is, in a sense, a victory that someone who had been deported, well, now they've gotten something back from the US government. They tried to get Alexander a pass as well, and that was just one bridge too far. The US government decided, even though they did declare he seemed repentant, he wasn't repentant. He was still too much of a security threat for them to buy that he would fully repented. So he doesn't get that privilege, though she and her mother do. And this is actually a picture of her going at school in Canada. She seems very outgoing, involved in lots of activities. This is her in a school play. in Canada, published in a local newspaper. So what then does this all kind of amount to, basically? So there's this sense of Russians, immigrants potentially needing to repent for the revolution. And the stories that both American-born and foreign-born radicals told about conditions after the Russian Revolution, they're going to actually have a big impact on immigration policy. So when we're looking at getting this commuter pass to go back and forth between the US and Canada, it's a small thing, but this concept is going to have a bigger effect on US immigration policy. So these images about reaffirming the danger of communism, these stories about it, they create sympathy for the victims of communism. And American anti-radicals see Russian communism as directly opposed to American democracy, and they're going to basically end up assuming that if someone opposes communism, therefore they support American democracy. A rejection of the Soviet Union is automatically support for America and American values. And so through this suffering under communism, they believe that radicals might repent. And so eventually, for officials in the departments of state and labor, the suffering Bolshevism created by threatening religion, by threatening the family, by threatening morality, it's going to justify manipulating immigration policies to enable the admission of people they particularly identify as the victims of communism. And throughout the rest of the 20th century, American officials are going to test the boundaries of their discretion, see what it is that they're able to do to avoid enforcing policies that they don't like, to avoid deporting someone that they think should stay in the United States because this person is a victim of communism, or to find a way to help someone enter the United States, even though there's a growing number of immigration restrictions because they are a victim of communism. And so, these immigration policies end up being manipulated for Russian immigrants, as well as others, who are able to define themselves as counter-revolutionary allies of democracy. And it's based on that assumption that if you oppose communism, you must be with the United States. So, and that is not always the case. As in, Emma Goldman never, accepted American democracy. She was always an anarchist, but she still opposed the Soviet Union. But that subtlety, that distinction tends to get missed inside of these immigration cases, as American officials are manipulating policy. So with that, that concludes my talk for today. If anyone has any questions, I would love to hear them.
I have a microphone for anyone with a question. We have a question back here, so I'll get to you next so that we can hear your question with the mic.
Oh, hold on. Someone will bring you a mic so we can all hear.
Just wondering if Canada was going through the same situation that the U.S. was.
Yeah, so the United States is not unique in having a post-World War I Red Scare. There are other countries that are going to be experiencing this as well. And Canada I think people might often see it now as being much more open in terms of immigration than the United States. In the early 20th century, its policies, I think, were just as harsh, if not harsher, than the United States. So the United States government does work with and cooperate with Canada in cases, and there are red scares in other parts of the world too. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You had a question here?
I did. I'm not sure if it's on topic here, but how did communism get the color red? I mean, how did those things get associated together? You know?
Yeah, it's because it has been so associated with, it is just red. And by the way, anarchism is associated with black, by the way, as a color. And I actually, I don't know how specifically it ended up being coded that way.
I can answer that question real quick.
Someone knows. Excellent.
Yeah, I'm the education manager, Matt, for those of you who don't know. So red gets associated with communism and most left-wing movements starting in the 1820s, very early on. There's sort of a mythical story of a specific strike that happened in Wales, and the striking workers, as they are kind of combating with some British police and soldiers, fly a red flag that's supposed to be symbolic of the blood of the working class. And so from that point on, it kind of takes on this mythical stance, and it gets associated with a variety of other different communist movements and socialist movements as they developed through the 19th century. So.
Interesting. Thanks, Matt.
I did just so you could see.
Yes.
Hi, so the question I have is this the first mass deportation that the U.S. government had tried since inception?
This really was the first big one where they would raid places before and deport groups of people, but this is the first time they tried to do things like, time raids, coordinate them across a bunch of cities at the same time, so it would be a surprise to arrest such a large volume of people. Not raiding a place and arresting a few dozen people, but raiding so many places to get so many.
So follow-up. And how many more since?
There have been several more efforts, since then, of the United States, trying to conduct mass raids. The agencies, they do start to learn from this experience. And so, for instance, the United States is going to target, say, in the 1950s, they will target Mexican immigrants in the United States in mass raids to send people back. So it does happen periodically after this.
What happened to William?
So what happens to William? He does end up staying, with his family. So he actually had Canadian citizenship by birth, and so he's going along. He ends up following his family through all of this, and ends up, growing up in Canada with them. There were stories, as part of also the American reformers wanting to build sympathy for the family. There's a story about William pretending to be an immigration inspector where he denies people passes to visit their families, because, as a child playing pretend, this is what he's doing. But I start to lose track of what happens to them after the 1920s in Canada. I think most likely what happens, like Violet ends up getting married has a new last name, and I'd need to, track more through Canadian records to figure out what happens, as opposed to the American records that I was using for the deportations.
Trying to relate it to lessons for today. Is most of them that were deported or sent back were documented citizens that, because of their belief, were sent back, and not really any action of breaking the law or anything? I know you mentioned a few bombings that might have been breaking the law, but most of them are just because of their belief.
So for these particular raids, these were targeted against immigrants, because they could be deported. There were definitely, people who get arrested who are American citizens, but they're handled through more of a regular criminal, American criminal justice system. And for Americans, if someone, belonged to the Communist Party, or, just believed in these ideas, like that wasn't enough to really, take legal action against them. They had to actually, be engaged in committing a crime. For immigrants, however, there's going to be a big debate. How much does it take for someone to be deportable? Is mere membership in a radical organization enough? Does that violate the conditions upon which someone was allowed into the United States? And the government will have cases where they go through each radical organization and they decide membership in the Union of Russian Workers, that's enough. Membership in the Communist Party, that's enough to deport someone. Membership in the Communist Labor Party, however, was not. What the real difference between the Communist Party and the Communist Labor Party and its philosophy was, there isn't really that much of a difference, but it was dependent on how the court found things or how the government found things at the moment. So that's part of why the government is like collecting like things like people's like membership books. It's like, oh, well, if membership in the Communist Party is enough, if I have a membership book with your name on it, that's enough for deportation. That was the concept that the government was working with.
Matt's got a question.
Real quick before my question, just for the rest of the crowd, I have lots of great questions. If you do have a bit more interest in like this time period, I know there's a question about it with other countries, I suggest looking up the Red Years as a topic for most like European countries for their responses to the Russian Revolution, and the Red Summer specifically for the United States. Those are topics that tie in a lot to what Dr. Orr is talking about here. My question for you, Dr. Orr, is as these anti-radicalist positions are being pushed, how much are they looking back to the US's kind of cultural history dealing with that? So are they referencing like Haymarket and Sacco and Vanzetti and other like propaganda of the deed that's occurred in the United States?
Absolutely, they definitely are. So Haymarket, that happened in 1886, the bombing after a labor rally in Haymarket Square in Chicago. And it was a formative moment for both anti-radicals and radicals, where radicals are looking at the memory of this, the memory of the people, who they considered the martyrs of Haymarket, who were tried unfairly for this bombing. And so it's something that galvanizes radicals. It lives in their memory, but it lives in the memory of anti-radicals too. And so like these images that I'm showing of radicals in the post-World War I period, they're very much drawing on those images of radicals from the late 1800s. And so Haymarket, for instance, is often associated, with German immigration and radicalism. But in the late 19th century, you start to get this shift from the fear of Germans, anarchists, more to Russian immigrants. But those styles of images, the concepts, those carry over a lot. The threat of, to morality, the threat of religion, the threat to family, even the visual depictions are still drawing on them.
Any other questions that I missed? Oh, over here.
You know, Kansas had a large group of German immigrants, and it could possibly be applied to them too. Were there any actions of repression or anything like that in Kansas?
Yes, there is a Red Scare in Kansas. There's a big trial that's associated with Kansas. The numbers, like in the raids, when we think of the raids, the biggest numbers come from places like New York, Detroit, Chicago as immigrant centers. But there are raids happening here in Kansas as well. There are people who are getting arrested. There are definitely there are trials. And so, yeah, Kansas is a part of this story too.
A follow-up question to that. Were the immigrants arrested in Kansas mostly from any particular town in the state, or kind of all over?
So the files that I remember seeing the most of came from the general Kansas City area, but it wasn't only the Kansas City area. And so you get people, like especially from areas of Kansas with larger immigrant communities, like mining towns, for instance. Those are going to be some of the places where the arrests happen. And in some cases, because of all of like the strikes and arrests that happened earlier, sometimes there weren't a lot of people left to arrest for the raids themselves. So it is happening in other parts of Kansas too, not just like, say, the Kansas City metro area.
Gotcha.
Although the government does tend to target the metro areas.
Any more questions for Dr. Orr? All right. Well, thank you so much for your time, Dr. Orr. Thank you for that enlightening presentation. Give her a round of applause, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Just as a reminder, everyone, March 20th is Coffee with the Curator, and April 3rd is our next Senior Wednesday. I just want to thank Professor Orr again. We've had several K-State professors recently, and I just want to express how much we appreciate that as a museum. It's not a short drive from Manhattan, so it means a lot to have you here to share your expertise with everyone. And I'm not a Wildcat myself, so I'm unbiased in saying this, that we really, oh yeah, Matt is. We really appreciate all the passion and love for history that the Department of History at K-State has, which makes programs like this possible for us. So thank you so much. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you.